Hello, welcome. I'm David Clooney, the Executive Director of the Black Economic Alliance. Welcome to our discussion today with the Democratic National Committee. I'll first introduce the speakers, and then I'll give a little bit of the backdrop for the conversation today, and then I'll introduce my co-moderator, Charles Phillips, the co-chair of the Black Economic Alliance. So first, we are lucky today to have Tom Perez, chair of the Democratic National Committee. He comes from a background of a long career of distinguished public service, most recently before the DNC as Secretary of Labor during the Obama administration, and before that as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, running the Civil Rights Division of the Obama Justice Department. We also have Muthoni Wambu-Krall, who is the Political and Organizing Director for the DNC, and we also have Nelwyn, we call her Nell Thomas, DNC's Chief Technology Officer. Thank all three of you for being here with us today. We know there's a lot going on in the world, but appreciate being able to have this conversation with you today. So before we get started, let me say we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the time we're in. I typically say good morning or good afternoon when we start these, and I didn't because today is not a good day. It hasn't been a good day. It hasn't been a good week. It certainly has not been a good year. Emotions are raw. People are feeling things that perhaps we should have been feeling a long time ago, but we have a moment in front of us. And a lot of people are asking, what can I do? What can we do? The Black Economic Alliance put out a statement yesterday talking about just the reality and the backdrop of where we are today in race relations, institutional racism, structural racism, and how those things play into every aspect of American life, particularly for Black people. When we answer the question of what can we do, there's no simple answer, there's no silver bullet. But in our statement and in our action, we talk about what we can do is stand up. Stand up together, stand up and be counted in the census, stand up and be counted absolutely at the ballot box, and stand up together, standing with and behind the peaceful protesters and anybody who stands out and speaks up against injustice. That's what our organization is about. We need to do this together, and we need to speak in very real terms about what racism is and where we are in America today. So with that backdrop, we're going to have a very real conversation. We talk about changing systems from the inside, from the outside, and all around. And this week, having discussion with the DNC today, with the RNC tomorrow, is an opportune time to talk about the political landscape we're in and just the stakes of the election of this year. So with that backdrop, I'll introduce my co-moderator, co-chair of the Black Economic Alliance, Charles Phillips, and Charles will kick us off with some questions. Hey, Charles, I think we have you on mute.
Am I off now?
There you go, mic is hot.
Oh, great, thanks for that intro. So Tom, Muthoni, and Neil, good to see you guys again. It was much different time when we saw each other, I guess, in South Carolina. Things have changed quite a bit, but so I appreciate you taking the time to do this for sure. I think we should just start off in the beginning, just by defining what the DNC does. We could tell by some of the questions that were coming in, people were kind of unclear on exactly your mission. They're confusing it a bit with the DCCC, the SEC. There's so many, the alphabet soup. So just a short description, maybe Tom, you kick that off, what the mission is, how you're different, and how would you kind of give the elevator pitch?
Sure. Good afternoon. And David, thank you for setting the tone, by the way. This is a somber time. And as someone who spent this bulk of my career doing police misconduct work, I've been to this movie, and it's never a good movie. But when we understand that this is America's problem, this isn't just Black America's problem, this is America's problem, that's when we come together. So I'm confident we'll talk about that more, but I would have been remiss if I didn't mention something at the outset. Our job at the DNC is to help elect Democrats up and down the ballot, Charles, from the school board to the Oval Office. And we do so by building strong parties, by building strong partnerships. I often say that my job is to build infrastructure and to build trust. And just to give you an example so people have context, roughly 8,000 candidates and campaigns are going to use our DNC infrastructure this coming cycle. So if you've given to a Senate candidate, or a presidential candidate, or you've given to a gubernatorial candidate, or even a school board candidate, there's a very, very high likelihood that they are using our voter file. If you've given to a federal candidate, there's basically a 100% likelihood that they're using our voter file. And so when I talk about infrastructure, there's really four types of infrastructure. There's data and technology infrastructure, including, but not limited to, cybersecurity. That's Nell's job, and she does it well, our Chief Technology Officer. There's organizing infrastructure, and that's Mathoni Wambu-Kral, our Political and Organizing Director. We invest in building permanent infrastructure of organizers across the country so that we can build relationships. All politics is personal, my former boss, Ted Kennedy, used to say. Another dimension of infrastructure is communications infrastructure. You're making sure we're out there talking to folks. I mean, we've trained 7,000 digital organizers in the last 8 weeks or so, so that they can get out there and communicate. And for the Biden campaign, we've built a ton of infrastructure. The fourth dimension of infrastructure is voter protection infrastructure. We know that voter suppression is a permanent staple, quite frankly, in the Republican playbook. You've heard President Trump talk repeatedly now. Even though he votes by mail, he's trying to demonize vote by mail, delegitimize vote by mail. And we've built a permanent voter protection infrastructure. And all of these forms of infrastructure that I'm talking about are designed to help candidates up and down the ballot. We're focused in the year 2020, without a doubt, on Vice President Biden. We're focused on all of these, but the infrastructure that we've been building for some time, we have over 600 people out in the field in the 6 battleground states that we've identified. And so we're already, we've handed that over, in effect, to the vice president, and that will help him win. I said it's about building infrastructure and building trust. We worked really hard to create a process in the run-up to the presidential primaries that would earn the respect of all of the voters. We knew we'd have a large field. I didn't think it'd be 24, Charles, but we knew we'd have a large field. And so we created a new set of rules to make sure that everybody got a fair shake, because our goal was to make sure that when we reached the end of the process and had a presumptive nominee, that every single candidate, because they got a fair shake, would come together with enthusiasm around our nominee. And that's exactly what's happened, and I'm very proud of that. So that, in a nutshell, is what we do. We build that runway, if you will, so that all the candidates can land the plane, take off the plane, working with so many other partners so that we can win elections up and down the ballot.
Okay, that's a good overview. So a lot of the questions had to do with your ability to affect outcomes in policy. And one of the things that you're familiar with is the party always has a platform in each convention. So I would think that would be one of the ways you can affect policy, at least what the party is talking about going forward. And for everybody's background, the last one in 2016 was about 45 pages, and it had sections in it like create good paying jobs, protect voting rights, finance system, on and on and on. What it didn't have was a platform for Black America, which is what a lot of the candidates have been talking about recently. Bloomberg had their Greenwood plan. Biden has worked on his now, and then it's evolving. Buttigieg has one. So I guess the question is, would it be different this time? A lot of people working on the platform and on the party in general, the convention, seem to be like the same people who've been doing it for quite some time. So it suggests it'd be the same. Or could there be something more specific for Black America in there going forward as a way to forcing people to think about the issues that we're dealing with right now?
Well, I think the moment we're in, Charles, demands action. When I think about where we're at right now, an unprecedented pandemic, an unprecedented economic collapse, and then the riots of the last few days, we're at just a inflection point in our economy, in our nation's journey to form a more perfect union. And I think our platform process is a real opportunity to really put in place what Fannie Lou Hamer said when talking about Mississippi in 1968. This isn't Mississippi's problem. This is America's problem. And we have to understand that. And I think our platform, Charles, is going to reflect the fact that what happened in Minnesota is not the first time we've heard someone say, I can't breathe. And I can't breathe economically either. Zip code way too frequently determines destiny. The color of your skin rather than the content of your character is undermining who we are as a nation. And so I think the platform, by necessity, must do so. And I hope people get an opportunity to read and listen and watch what the vice president said today. He spoke very eloquently about really, a Marshall Plan moving forward. And I'm confident that we're going to follow through on that, not just in the platform, but I'm talking about governance too, making sure that the day we get into office, we don't waste a second as an administration.
Yeah. I'm going to follow up on that because there's one specific suggestion that came in. There is a hate crimes bill that would make lynching a federal crime. It passed the House. The Senate passed their own version of it. I think Kamala Harris led that, but it never been reconciled and actually given to the president to sign. Could something that specific where people can see something tangible, the party get behind it, it's part of the platform, people have to respond to it. So there are things like that where people want to see something that resonates with the moment.
Sure. Well, as someone who spent a dozen years of my life here at the Justice Department prosecuting hate crimes, I'd love to have another tool in our arsenal. Barack Obama in 2009 signed the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. That was a huge step forward in our ability as a federal government to take on hate crimes cases. And the lynching provision, the anti-lynching provision that you're talking about would be another tool in the toolkit. That's what it's all about. The thing about passing tools and toolkits, though, Charles, that's really important, is that the tools are only as good as the will of the people enforcing those laws. Yeah. And, I spent a lot of time, really the bulk of my career, I spent doing police misconduct and hate crimes cases. And in 1994, 1995, we got a new tool to combat police misconduct. And it grew out of the Rodney King matter. And that was a tool that gave the Civil Rights Division the ability to go to court and file civil lawsuits to address patterns and practices of misconduct in police departments. It was huge. The criminal prosecution in Minnesota is an absolutely necessary but insufficient condition of seeking justice and systemic change in the Minneapolis Police Department. And the tool that must be used is this pattern and practice tool. The senator, by the way, who led the effort and got that bill into law was a guy named Joe Biden when he was a senator. And we used that tool with 15 police departments, Seattle, New Orleans, Portland, big departments, medium departments. That was how you change culture. Unfortunately, right now, the current administration it is not only not using it, is affirmatively hostile to using it. And so that's why I simply want to underscore the point that we need to make sure we have the tools, but we need to make sure that the people who have the power to enforce those tools have the will to do so. Because it breaks my heart to see that this administration is affirmatively hostile to using that tool. The pattern and practice authority I'm referring to, Charles, is probably the most important tool that Congress has given the federal government in the last 25 years to combat police misconduct. I know because I saw it, and it does work. It ain't easy. It's not going to happen fast, but let's make
I think
sure.
The thought was making it a federal crime takes it out of state hands, and local prosecutor has relationships, and so there's something tangible to that. Assuming there's a new administration in January, then you'd have something there to use.
Absolutely.
Okay, David.
Thanks, Charles. So I'd love to appreciate the context on the DNC platform. I'd love to drill down a level or two deeper on there and really talk about how it applies to Black Americans. This is really to Muthoni and Tom, but Tom, I've heard you refer to Black women as the backbone of the Democratic Party. We also know that Black voters, both in South Carolina and Super Tuesday and in general, completely changed the landscape of this year's primary. Want to talk about how that is translating in policy or in the platform, and particularly I'll use an example. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention what was getting a lot of news in the last few weeks. The Vice President Biden's his comments on Charlemagne's show, The Breakfast Club, about, if you have a hard time choosing between me and Donald Trump, you ain't black. I think what Black people take umbrage to in that statement is the assumption that Black people don't have a choice, that they don't have a choice but to vote for the Democratic candidate. And I think that's something that is a sense of frustration that the Black community has felt with both parties, but I think more so with the Democratic Party, that their vote is taken for granted. So I want to hear how you're thinking in very specific terms. People have asked for a Black VP nominee, a Black Supreme Court justice, a more specific Black economic agenda, wondering how you're talking in very specific terms to Black folks in your engagement.
Sure. Tony, I've done all the talking so far. Do you want to start? And then I will, I look forward.
Thank you. I really wanted to hear from Mathoni on that.
Yeah, because I have some thoughts. I know Mathoni does as well.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. Those are all really thoughtful questions. And, as you can see from my sign behind me, I'm kind of an OG when it comes to the vice president. And I still know that what he said was really unfortunate and offensive. I also think that the apology that was issued afterwards was really clear, and it was no BS. I think that he is taking the steps that we need to see in a very concrete way to demonstrate the fact that he doesn't feel anywhere near what that indicated about the fact that Black voters don't have a choice. He's run too many times to know that that is actually not the case in a state where African Americans are over 22% of the population, and where when he ran as a young senator for that seat, he would not be there if it weren't for the support of the Democratic base, and that is oftentimes and continues to be African Americans. So the work that is being done now, and that has really, I think, come together between the DNC and the Biden campaign, is you are looking at a campaign that came out of a primary. It was a very small campaign too, and so they are now scaling up. And we're really starting to see, I think, a much better indicator of what the staff is going to look like, who is going to be around him. And that's a really important piece that I think we all look at as we judge what kind of work is going to get done, who's helping to impact the strategy, who is supporting him, who are the voices that are going to be influencing a lot of the policy decisions. And I think that the campaign has made some incredibly smart hires lately, having Karine Jean-Pierre go over and having Julia Rodriguez go over and having Ashley Allison, who will now head up all of their partnership work. I'm feeling great as a staffer about who I will be partnering with as we build out sort of the strategic ecosystem and a lot of the relationships that will not only be important as he runs this race, but as you know very well, you have been in an administration, and a lot of this is preparation for who's going to be around governing. And I feel that the chairman is always really strong about that continuation. And how is it that we are going to build the through line? And so all of the engagement that BEA is doing right now, this is an incredibly important moment to lean all the way in. It is a time right now where shaping can happen, and that includes the platform committee. There is a lot in that platform process, and I know that we can send more information so that you can send this out to your members about how folks can submit questions and how they can be engaged. I know that our convention team overall is looking for this to be an extremely interactive, no matter the circumstances, physical, all of that. We have real pros that are looking at all of the ways that we are going to make this an engaging convention. And the same thing with our platform process. So, engagement right now is, as I think, as open a possibility as we make it. And that is also the nice thing when folks have come in. It's been a rough haul, and no one over at that campaign wouldn't say so. South Carolina made a huge difference in the vice president's victory. And so I think that as Black people, we have a right to feel that we are in a very strong position to have a strong and impactful voice inside of this campaign.
We had, to Mathoni's spot on remarks, two dimensions to what I'd like to observe. Number one, we take no one for granted. We know we have to earn people's votes. And we know, frankly, that in the past, we haven't always worked as hard as we should for everyone's vote. That's why we had an initiative called Organizing Corps, which we began in 2019, where we were hiring 1,200 organizers in 8 battleground states so that we're talking to voters early. We knocked on 25,000 doors the summer of 19 in Detroit, 20,000 doors in Milwaukee, talking to voters. You know, I spoke to those Org Corps participants. By the way, 76% of whom were organizers of color, 95% were homegrown. So the Wisconsin organizers were almost all from Wisconsin, the Michigan from Michigan, Georgia from Georgia, et cetera. And what they said to me was people were confused when I was knocking on their door. I said, what do you mean? Well, they were used to the Democratic Party showing up 2 weeks before the election, and it was 18 months before the election. And that reflected, I think, what really was embodied in part of your question, David, which is that we need to make sure we are organizing early, organizing everywhere, building authentic relationships everywhere. And under Mathony's leadership, that's been a huge part of our ethos as a party. Now, substantively, you know, when I think about the Black economic agenda, I really think about the March on Washington, because as we think about where we are right now with an economic collapse and the original sin once again laid bare in Minneapolis, we have to be thinking about this. This is about economic justice, and it's about racial justice. I was talking recently with one of your board members, Broderick Johnson, and we were talking about something I did when I was at the Labor Department. The Labor Secretary is, by statute, the chair of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. And when I got there as chair, one of the first questions I asked was, we manage a lot of money at the PBGC. Why is it that none of our money managers are minority-owned businesses? So we did an RFP. We put it out because we wanted to lead an effort to make sure we expanded ladders of opportunity in government, that we practice what we preached. And Broderick was one of the people who helped lead this. And we succeeded at the PBGC. What we have to do when we get in office is understand those levers of power, those levers of opportunity, to make sure we open up those opportunities for African-American businesses. We also have to make sure that many of these programs that have been put in place to get us out of this hole we're in actually work for people. You know, the PPP was an abysmal example of a program that was not working for all too many African-American, Latino, and Native American owned businesses. It just wasn't working. And we've got to make it work. And so, you know, it frustrates me because under President Obama, we brought the unemployment rate among African Americans down by 1/2, and now we're back up to 17% again, or whatever it is. We'll probably be closer to 20 when we get the jobs report this week. We've got a lot of work to do. But I think we know that we have to go with a sense of urgency. Day one, we've got to get in. And folks on this Zoom call, I hope you will consider a career in government, because one thing I learned firsthand from my career in public service is the person who's in the chair in these jobs really, really matters. And I hope you will engage. And I know Joe Biden, read his speech today, and I think you have a sense of someone who's completely committed moving forward to making sure that we work with a fierce urgency of now. And what he said in that speech, the last thing I'll say here, is what, if you look at our history, and the most bold things that have happened in our nation's history have often happened in the aftermath of really challenging times, whether it was the Great Depression and all the New Deal that followed, the civil rights movement of the 60s following a very tumultuous period. We're in a tumultuous period now. And the remedy isn't to be fearful, it's to be bold. And it's to be aggressive.
Let's talk specifics on what you have to do between now and November to get Vice President Biden in that chair, as you say. I think people look at the 2016 election, and there's a sense that we just got the Electoral College math wrong, that it doesn't help to win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College. And if you look at the Cook political report, they're focusing on about 6 swing states that they think will, make up the election. Largest being Florida, but they have Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin on there. And then the second dimension of that is we didn't focus enough on turning out the Black vote in key areas where it would have made a difference. And so I guess help people feel better or differently about what are you doing now versus what happened then, so we don't repeat that where we win the popular vote but still lose the election.
And let me just add some context to that question too. On the point of Black voter turnout, we find ourselves at a time of unprecedented unrest, or maybe unprecedented is not right. We've had a lot of moments like this in the past, but more importantly, during a pandemic, when how people are going to vote is in question, and at the same time there are active voter suppression efforts being taken to suppress, in particular, the Black vote. So just adding that layer of context to Charles's question.
Well, let me start, and then I want Nell to dig a little deeper on the data tech piece and Mathony on the organizing piece. We took way too many voters for granted in 2016. We didn't organize everywhere. We were mobilizing. We weren't organizing. We showed up in Detroit in September, not the summer before, and we paid a price for that. And when I came to the DNC, what we did in response was we became a 50-state party again. We invested early. We invested everywhere. We invested together. We worked with the ecosystem. And again, look at 2017, 2018, 2019. What they all have in common is Democrats won at scale. And we won at scale because we made those wholesale investments in infrastructure. Last year in Wisconsin, by way of example, we knocked on almost 300,000 doors together with and led by the Wisconsin Democratic Party. 4 years earlier, it was probably 3,000 doors. That's the difference between then and now. We made wholesale investments in data, technology, and cybersecurity. And again, 8,000 candidates are going to use our voter file. And I'm going to put a pin in that because Nell's going to give you more granularity. We've had comms people and other infrastructure folks on the ground in those 6 battleground states since last year. And to go to your voter protection aspect of the question, we have to understand that voter protection is a permanent staple in the Republican playbook. That's why we have voter protection directors in place in 19 states. We've had them in place. We were able to win an election in Wisconsin recently, even though the other side was trying to weaponize the pandemic to suppress the vote in Milwaukee so they could steal that state Supreme Court case. We won that seat because we used a combination of organizing, digital organizing, and litigation. And our litigation enabled 142,000 people who would have been otherwise disenfranchised to vote. So let me turn to Nell and then to Mathony, because I'm really, really proud of the work we've done in the data technology space, Charles, that should give all of your viewers a lot of confidence about this infrastructure that every candidate will be able to use.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for taking a chance to talk about data and tech, my favorite area of conversation. So to speak to the question of how we win states, ultimately a campaign's job, right, is to talk to voters effectively and to know what voters they need to turn out, who they need to persuade, and how to get them to the polls. And that relies on having really, really good data about who is registered to vote, who needs to be registered to vote, and their kind of history as a voter, as well as key consumer information about how to reach them and their lifestyle. And I worked in the 2016 Clinton campaign, and that campaign did a lot of things really well. It did some things not so well. But one of the challenges was inheriting a very weak infrastructure, especially around some of those core important pieces of information about voters. And so it just meant that we had to spend a lot of our time as a campaign doing kind of basic cleaning and investment work in basic pieces of data and infrastructure. And so one of the reasons I came to the DNC was because I felt so strongly that that type of work should not be repeated campaign after campaign after campaign, and especially for smaller and down ballot races that can't afford to acquire data or kind of rebuild basic data models, that we as a DNC should be providing that across the party. And so that's what we've been laser focused on the data and tech side for the last 3 years, is really rebuilding a strong infrastructure. So to give you some specific examples of that, that means doing things like understanding who is being removed from voter rolls on a regular basis, and who is staying on them. Understanding not just that someone has registered since last year in Michigan, but actually before that, they were registered in Florida for 15 years, and all the information we have about what they, where they turned out and what they turned out for in Florida. So really doing a better job of connecting dots. Specifically, an example in Kentucky from 2019 is that as part of our ongoing work to constantly ingest and process new files from states, is our ability to detect when there's systematic purges of voters, which is obviously a tactic used especially by Republican-leaning secretaries of state. So in 2019, the DNC tech team noticed around 125,000 voters had been purged, predominantly from African-American communities. The information was given to the state party as well as Fair Fight. They sued, they got those voters reinstated on the rolls. And that was an election for Governor Beshear that was won by around 5,000 votes. So kind of an example of where really making sure we're investing in being laser focused on who is registered to vote where we need to get more people registered to vote, and then ultimately making sure that we have really good data about understanding how to target and turn out those voters. And I'll hand it over to Mathoni to speak more about the programmatic work the DNC does and campaigns do to invest in actually kind of delivering to those voters the right message at the right time on the right channel to get them to the polls.
Thank you, Nell. We have been hard at work, as the chairman pointed out, making sure that we made time, we made the most of our time, which we know is our most important resource, and making sure that we really utilize the this window before we had a nominee to first and foremost make these relationships with the communities, period. That this is something that the party needed to do better. And we have, and it's been big and it's been intersectional. And I've got an incredible constituency team that is working closely with the Biden constituency team and organizing team. And so much of what we did was to make sure that no matter who that nominee was going to be, that we were helping to create a diverse path for them. And that we were helping to ensure that we were not making them Johnny come lately, and that in fact, or Jill, if we'd had a woman, but that we were putting together this really curated programming through our constituency work. And so you've seen, you may have seen Seat at the Table, which is our very specific Black women facing programming that came very early on, and that was even before we sort of got into this cycle. This started last election cycle, and then Chop It Up has joined Seat at the Table, and that is our Black male-facing programming that we're doing out of the DNC and working closely with the Biden campaign on executing. We, as the chairman said, through Organizing Core 2020, we have hired up all of these incredible organizers who are from, most of them from the communities where they are going to be organizing. And this was literally a historic investment in Black and Brown organizers. That has been the majority of our classes, and we've had 3 waves. We're on our 3rd and final wave right now. And it's a program that not only is being utilized by our coordinated campaigns on the ground, but it also offered up some opportunities for some of these folks to go and work for some of our other Democratic campaigns. We have an incredibly diverse staff helping to inform our decisions. We have made early investments in Black press, which I think Tom said, and early investments in our voter protection programs. But there's also, you know, inside of all of this, there are some other things that were real challenges for us, David, as you know, in the 2016 election. And organizing is a big, important piece of it. Voter suppression is something that we've already talked about, and we are ahead of the game in terms of trying to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for a big battle. But all of the litigation that the DNC has been bringing alongside a lot of the other committees, I mean, it's been really a lot of partnership and with other progressive organizations, state by state, knocking down a lot of these really antiquated laws that are barriers to access. But in addition to all of that, there is one that doesn't get talked about enough, and that is disinformation. We were targeted as a community And they are continuing. I mean, unfortunately, the Republican Senate has left the doors wide open for this kind of manipulation of our elections again, and has decided in a very clear way not to protect our citizenry. And so we are going to have to do this ourselves, unfortunately. Without that kind of federal support and leadership, we will have to do this ourselves. And so the DNC has established a counter disinformation unit within our DNC tech team that Nell can kind of chime in on if I'm missing anything. But it is truly incredible to see what they have built out, and they have kind of really streamlined the information down so that it is user friendly for folks like us to pass these guides along inside our organizations, whatever they may be. And I'm sure if you are active in BEA, you are probably active in lots of other organizations as well. You're a joiner, and that is great. You're an influencer, and we need more people influencing on disinformation. And there are some of the basic things that we know that folks need to do around monitoring what we are passing along. Who are we allowing to make us some sort of intermediary? If you're an influencer, thinking about what you are sharing and where that information is coming from is incredibly, incredibly important. And now you can add anything that I may be missing, but we can also share with you all after this call the guide that we have that folks can pass around.
Yeah, actually, I think that's an important point to drill down on, because both in 2016, you had, after the fact, all 17 members of the intelligence community, the federal agencies in the intelligence community said there was interference by a foreign adversary, by Russia, that successfully influenced our election. And if you think about the moment we're in right now, there has already been talk about whether there are people, capitalizing on and exploiting social media and different demonstrations as a means to put out more confusion and division, as a means to confuse the election in November. So would love you to double click on that point a little bit and talk in specific terms, Nell, about what we're doing from a digital perspective to a technology perspective, rather, to fortified protections to make sure we don't end up our election system doesn't end up as vulnerable as it was in 2016.
And David, she can also add to the battle that we are up against with some of these platforms and the level of the responsibility that we can all continue to place the pressure on these platforms to do the right thing. I'll go.
That was what I was going to bring up for Nell, because Donald Trump spent about $62 million on between Google and Facebook, according to the latest number. Biden did around 21 million. So just the sheer scale is one concern. And then secondly, we all saw what happened in Iowa. I know that wasn't you and your team, but people's perception is that should have been resolved some sort of way by the DNC. So maybe you can address that as well as part of your answer.
Yeah, we got a lot of stuff in that question. To very quickly address the first point about foreign adversaries, I think that there are three major topics that just came up. So one is everything we're doing to secure our technologies and secure our staff against potential attacks, hacking, email leaks. And in that front, we've hired for the very first time the DNC as a chief security officer, former chief security officer of Yahoo and Twitter. And he's been focused for the last couple of years on securing the DNC systems, as well as doing a lot of educational work across the ecosystem. And obviously, you can never promise full security, but the idea is that we're reducing our attack surfaces and putting in place a lot of monitoring and detection that will allow us to have a much stronger security stance than we've ever had before. In the second bucket, which is like this disinformation that's being spread online, there's a couple things there. There's one, the fact that these social media companies are failing to police even organic content, as we call it, so non-advertising content, but just the words that the president is speaking on Twitter or on Facebook that are clearly violations of the policies they've set in place around not inciting violence and around not lying about voting. So those are fights we've been engaged in very closely with both Facebook and Twitter. And we've continued to put pressure on them through face-to-face conversations with Sheryl Sandberg and Susan Wojcicki at YouTube, and senior leadership at Twitter, as well as, kind of on the ground every day issuing takedown requests and kind of fighting the fight with their content moderators. The third area is digital spend, which I think, Charles, you just brought up around just how much money is being spent on these platforms. And, that is where having a nominee helps a lot. We don't have the fragmented donation system we had, or donation ecosystem we had a few months ago, where there was no single leader in the Democratic fundraising race. So now I think the fundraising is in a much stronger position, which means that the Biden campaign has more recently really started to pick up their online spend around reaching voters on Facebook and Google, which is a very good thing because they certainly need to be present there and putting out their own content. Which is a long way of saying I think that there are kind of different tactics we're taking in each of those spaces to try to compete. I think in some areas we are at a structural disadvantage, like with Facebook and YouTube, to be quite honest. And I am a former Facebook staffer, so I say that knowing the systems in place, because they're very, very hesitant to police content in the way that they should be. I think there are other areas where we have an inherent advantage, which is the truth is there are more Democrats than there are Republicans, and we have a much wider grassroots network. And if we can properly mobilize and tap into that online, then we have incredible power behind us. And so I think a lot of that is just making sure that we have inspiring content, and we have the right people getting content in front of them. So that was a little bit of a broad set of topics I just touched on quickly, but all incredibly important ones, and areas that we are at the DNC deeply committed to supporting the Biden campaign being successful across those areas.
Appreciate that, and we're just about out of time, so I want to turn to you all all three of you, just ask for closing comments, a call to action, what you want to leave this group with at such an important time. So maybe Muthoni, we'll start with you, Nell, and then Tom.
Thanks so much. I would just invite everyone to please join us in this fight. And we are really at an opportune moment, as I said before, and there are a lot of ways to be engaged, not just with the DNC writ large, but for those who ask questions about platform, we are happy to guide you to being very specific about how you want to do your action, or what it is that you want to lend your expertise to, your energy, your time, whatever resources, money, all of it, all of the above. It is really important that it is something that you feel committed to, because we are in the fight of our lives, as we know right now, from looking outside of every door. Many of you may be outside those doors, out in the streets, or in some way helping out a lot of our folks inside of the movement. But this is the other side of it. This is the what's next part, and we all know that. And so doing everything that is going to hopefully be an investment of your time that sort of pays dividends throughout as we go through this campaign and into the governing side of things. And that is, like I said, if it's platform, if it is, if you want to be a volunteer and help with some of the organizing, we've got ways for people to do that even while we're all still self-isolating. And we have lots of other ways for folks to be engaged. So I am just making a direct ask to your members to think about joining the Democratic Party in this fight. And I'm happy to break down many of the different ways that we can do that. We'll send a follow-up, Doc.
Thanks, Muthoni. Now,
Muthoni, before you move on, one quick question for you. I didn't hear you say vote by mail, which we may all be doing by November, and it's not something traditionally Black people have done. It's like 11% according to the census data. It's like 47% for Asians. So who's educating and taking that on if we have to do that?
Yeah, that is absolutely a huge priority for the DNC. And we are working in close collaboration with a lot of the coalition partners who have been involved, whether it's Fair Fight, but there are other sort of larger coalitions that Fair Fight is also a part of. And the DNC has been engaged on the Hill. We have been engaged in the legislation, in these stimulus bills, and making sure that there's going to be the kind of funding that is needed in order to enact a lot of these reforms that we need to take place inside of the states to expand access to the ballot. And that is not just vote by mail, but that is also making sure that there are longer early vote windows, that there is more robust absentee ballot programs, and that there are actual physical options for people. I hate to admit, it's my dirty little secret. I'm going to vote in person today in DC. I didn't want to go to the post office. So, and whatever psychology is going on with me that I'm going to go to my voting center and not to the post office, I am giving myself that grace. I'm going to mask up and I'm going to vote. But we've got to give people that option. And we know that when those in-person sites are limited, that is usually going to impact the neighborhoods and communities where Black and Brown people live. And people below a certain economic strata. So we are fighting for all of the above right now. And I ask the chairman to, of course, chime in, because he has been tireless in being at the center of this for the committee.
Thanks, Mathony, and thanks for that really important question, Charles. That was an important point to make. Nell?
Yeah, I will just kind of tack on to Mathony's call for support and action by saying, I know many of you have expertise likely in the areas I focus on: technology, data, cybersecurity. There's much more intelligence and expertise outside of the building of the DNC than there is inside it, even though we pride ourselves at being pretty good. But we know there's no monopoly on having all the right answers, and we certainly seek input and advice. So I would say for any of you who have expertise or insight into things that we've talked about here around disinformation, around digital ad buying, around data, please feel free to make yourself known to me. Reach out. I'm sure David or Charles could get you my information, and would love, support and help. And, I would also just echo that we are taking absentee voting incredibly seriously, as from a technology and data perspective as well as voter protection. Those are both areas that we do tech work. So if you're, involved in a legal profession where you do any sort of volunteer legal work, that's a really important area for us to be supporting as well. So all topics we care deeply about and are certainly always looking for advice and support around. And I'll let Tom have the last word on all that.
Thanks, Nell, and thanks, Mathony. Thank you, Charles and David, and thanks to all of you who've been watching today. I'm so grateful for the time you've allowed us to spend with you. And I do want to underscore what both Mathony and Nell said, which is this isn't a one-off. I want to make sure, there were questions right at the outset about platform. You ought to have a seat at the table during that process. And I look forward to working with you on how to make that happen. Another really important area is the area of transition. In June 2008, I started working on Obama transition. Now that may sound presumptuous to some, but if you're not planning for what you're going to do the day after, months and months ahead, then you're not doing your job effectively. And I was proud to be part of the Team Obama transition. So if there are areas you want to get involved in, please do. We obviously appreciate any investment you can make. That would be great as well. I keep thinking about, in the aftermath of Minneapolis, something that Donald Trump said in Detroit about 2 weeks or so before the election in 2016, in which he said to African-American voters, "What do you have to lose?" We now have 3.5 years of data to answer that question. We have a COVID pandemic that has resulted in over 100,000 lives lost, disproportionately the lives of African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. The disparities, they're overwhelming. Look at the unemployment cliff we've fallen down. The unemployment rate we had worked so hard to bring down in the Obama administration, and now we're well above where we were. You look at access to healthcare. The Affordable Care Act was a boon for African Americans, Latinos, because we were among the ranks disproportionately of the uninsured. So we know the answer to that question: your life, your livelihood, and your health care. So many of the critical things. And the thing about it right now is, as someone who's spent his entire life in the intersection of labor and civil rights, it really was the March on Washington. You know, I've seen voter suppression firsthand. I took on the state of Texas, South Carolina, and so many other states when I led the Civil Rights Division. I saw that voter suppression then. It took the form of voter purges and voter ID laws, redistricting that was a very racial gerrymander. Now we see, quite frankly, we see voter suppression on steroids. And what we have to understand as a group, as a country, quite frankly, is this is not something new. It is a permanent staple in the playbook. If you go back 40 years to a meeting that took place of the modern conservative movement, there was a person there who said, his name is Paul Weyrich, one of the founders of the modern conservative movement. He said, and I quote, this is not a paraphrase, "Our leverage in elections goes up, quite frankly, as the voting populace goes down." And when they mean voting populace, they mean the voting populace of African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans. And that is why one of the things I did at the DNC was to make sure we build a permanent voter protection infrastructure. Charles's question at the end there, these questions are so critically important because we need to make sure, Joe Biden started his speech out today with, I can't breathe. Well, you know, when we don't have effective constitutional policing, our democracy can't breathe. When we don't have access to the ballot for everyone, a right that people fought and died for, our democracy can't breathe. And that is why we are working so hard right now when I talk about infrastructure. And it's an all hands on deck enterprise. It's Mathony, it's Nell, it's myself, it's our voter protection team. It's every single team because it's so intersectional. And the reason why I talk about this is I want to make sure that voters have choice. I have a very acute understanding, Charles, because you're spot on, that for so many people, especially African Americans, voting at the voting booth is a cultural experience, and we need to respect that. At the same time, Charles, as we all know, in April in Wisconsin, there's supposed to be 180 precincts in the city of Milwaukee, and there were 5 because of what happened. 5. We went from 180 down to 5. They've documented no less than 10 cases of COVID from people who were participating in voting in April. And so we have to be prepared for every eventuality. And that is why we need to make sure that there are in-person opportunities so that people can vote. We need to make sure that there's expanded early voting. And you look at the Commonwealth of Virginia, now that Democrats control everything there, they passed a very good set of laws that made Election Day a holiday so people could go vote, expanded early voting, eliminated the voter ID requirement, which was pernicious, and allowed for no excuse absentee voting. We need to give people choice so that if you have more early voting and we're still in a pandemic, you can socially distance because not everybody's coming on one day. We need to make sure there's no excuse absentee. We need to make sure there are vote by mail options if, God forbid, we are in lockdown this November. I saw what happened in April in Wisconsin. And what pains me, because we should make it easier for everybody to vote who's eligible, not harder. And what pains me is to see what the Republicans are doing on steroids now, weaponizing this pandemic. Donald Trump voted by mail. Almost his entire cabinet votes by mail. If you actually look at the studies on vote by mail, it doesn't give a partisan advantage. But now Donald Trump, who's so scared of losing, is weaponizing this. And I've heard Ronna McDaniel talk about it. And I don't know why she's doing that. Because she said herself, if you want to give people, if you want to mail them their absentee ballot applications, I've got no problem with it. Now she's singing from the Trump hymnal. We can't allow the other side to undermine public confidence in our upcoming election. There will be an election on November 3rd. That's one thing I will say to you with confidence, notwithstanding efforts to the contrary. But I really need your help between now and then to make sure that everybody has the ability to exercise their right to vote. I applaud the Democrats. $400 million was in the initial stimulus bill to help facilitate states who need to expand options for voting. And it's not just vote by mail, expanding options for voting. Another $3.6 billion was included in the HEROES Act, passed the House, awaiting action in the Senate. We need to make sure we have that, because right now state and local governments are bankrupt in many cases, or nearly bankrupt. They don't have the money right now to make sure that the mechanisms of voting are in place for November. So that's why this is so important. I apologize for going over, but for me, when I think about voting and I think about what happened in Minnesota, I think about the fundamentals of our democracy, and we really need your help to make sure we can restore our democracy. This is an inflection point. I don't need to belabor that.
No,
And
we
with your
respect the
help-
passion. You wouldn't be head of the DNC if you didn't have that passion. That's great.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for being on. Mathoni, thank you. Nell, thank you all for your passion, for your work, and the important information you shared today. Charles, thank you for the important questions and the great moderation. Thank you to everybody who joined this afternoon. And we'll just leave you saying, stand up, be counted, absolutely vote. Find out the different ways you can vote. If BEA can be a resource, we would love to do that. We will be a resource getting information out to people. We are a nonpartisan organization. We don't tell people who to vote for. We tell you to vote. So make sure you do that this November and in all the elections leading up. Thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good.
Thanks.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.